He wasn't on a single deed. The thought came like a cold draft through the dining room, an unexpected breeze that slipped around crystal and gravy boat, and the gilt head of a woman who assumed her place at the table. Esha had set that table herself, linen pressed, the cornbread warm in its dish, the hydrangeas cut and arranged in a low blue vase. But she sat across the room on a smaller chair, where the lamps didn't quite reach. Tiffany took the head seat with both hands, as if the purchase of plates and chandeliers were the same as possession. She laughed loud enough to fill the room. Chinua laughed louder, clapping a palm to her knee as if the world outside their house had no other measure. Esha moved slowly that night, the motions of a person who had practiced economy for years, folding napkins, sliding bowls, tucking hair behind an ear. Her hands smelled faintly of butter and thyme. There was flour under her nails. When she carried the dish of cornbread to the table, someone made a small joke about domestic staff, and a ripple of polite amusement passed through Chinua's mother, Ms. Odette, who sipped her wine as if seasoning the conversation with approval. After the main course, when Tiffany's voice rose into a story about a party she planned with Chinua's business partners, Esha's seat at the table felt more like a role assigned by habit than by right. She had been the one who had made the gravy when Chinua's mother sang its praises, the one who had remembered how Ms. Odette liked her tea. That was public performance and private labor, both kept in a pocket inside her own coat. When the guests rose for coffee, someone mentioned the guest house playfully, as if it were a charming cottage rather than the place Esha had been sleeping for weeks. "Why don't you stay there tonight?" Chinua asked, that casual cruelty polished as if it were an amenity. "It's quieter. Tiffany needs to set the guest room up for the gala." Esha's hands stopped. She met Chinua's eyes for a moment that felt longer than the rest of the meal. There was no malice on his face, only entitlement, an assumption that he could assign the terms of her life like he might rearrange the furniture. He did not know, she thought, that the furniture of their lives had been moved without him, ever knowing which rooms were his. She let them speak, let Tiffany fuss. She gathered her coat in the doorway later with the same practiced calm as always. The guest house was small, windows catching the moon and refusing to show the house where laughter and chandeliers glowed. From there, she could see the porch light and the way the hydrangeas cast a shadow against the brick. She let herself be seen as small that night, because she had long ago learned how to be quiet without breaking. When the property manager knocked on the front door and handed Chinua a paper he could not read on the spot, it was the kind of practical humiliation that halts a person in their tracks. The manager read the lines aloud in a voice practiced in the language of ownership. The main house was scheduled for transfer. It was under new custodial control pending verification. Chinua's face flushed. "What is this?" he asked. "What do you mean?" He did not suspect Esha. He didn't imagine that the woman rearranging napkins had also been rearranging ledgers. Nobody did, not Ms. Odette, who lifted her eyebrows in cultivated surprise. Not Marcus, Chinua's brother, who shrugged and reached for his drink as if to dissolve the moment. Not Tiffany, who stilled, lipstick cold as a new coin. Esha watched them find themselves in the shapes they had always assumed existed for them to fill. The owner, the inheritor, the outsider who could be shuffled. Outside, under a sky so clear you could read trouble in the stars, Esha walked the path to the guest house and held the brass key at her throat. It hung on a slim chain, the metal worn bright by years of being turned over in her hands. The key was small, almost ridiculous. A domestic thing, really, and that was exactly why it mattered. Grandma Cleo had pressed it into her palm the year Esha left Mississippi, and it had been warm with the woman's hands. "This key doesn't open anything yet," her grandmother had told her, the way an elder passes along a secret like a recipe. "Not for a while, but you keep it, and you watch." If Esha had a posture of patience, it began there, on a porch with cornbread crumbs cooled in Tupperware, and a paper fan on a kitchen table. Grandma Cleo's porch had smelled of laundry starch and magnolia sap. The rocking chair had left its old squeak deep in Esha's ribs. Cleo had taught her to mark time by other people's guesses, where they put themselves when they imagined the future. "Watch," she had said. "They are louder than their knowledge." Flashbacks came quietly to her now. Not the fever of memory, but the slow unspooling of small facts. Scholarships won quietly, a first internship that involved sweeping the floors of a law clerk's office, nights at a second-hand desk when other students went out, a graduation photo she kept in a drawer where the edges were worn by thumbs. The first time she signed something that mattered, it felt like stepping into a room with locked doors and turning the handle with nothing more than steadiness. The brass key was a talisman, a reminder of timing. Esha's formation had been practical and patient. She studied law and real estate finance with the determination of someone constructing a house out of spare boards. She learned the shape of corporate language and the way an estate could be parceled into companies and trusts, each layer like a room with its own door. She had not built those protections to prove a point. She had built them because she had been taught to prepare, and preparation is the quiet opposite of revenge. She formed LCB Group on a Tuesday, in a cramped office above a florist shop, the name scratched on a binder that smelled faintly of soil. The company did not begin as spectacle. It began in filings and meetings and phone calls that left no echoes. LCB grew like a root system, under the ground, out of sight. Subsidiaries beneath holding companies, trusts that held shares like locked chests, authorized signatories named precisely, and arranged so that visible accounts could not be touched without the deeper keys. It was, she thought of it later, like building layered safe rooms across different states, each one connected by legal passageways that required more than bold hands to cross. She hired Portia, her assistant, a woman with a bright laugh and the patience of someone used to reading the small print in life. Portia handled correspondence and calendars, but more importantly, she filed things into the right places. Warren, the head of a consortium, was a discreet ally who believed in quiet fortune. He executed large moves with the soft touch of someone who understood the ethics of discretion. Deshawn, a cousin, fed her gossip in exchange for small favors. Marcus and Ms. Odette were for a time merely background noise, the sounds of a family that assumed the future belonged to them. Esha's growth was not spectacular in headlines. She did not parade ownership. She built assets in clean, lawful ways, investments in developmental properties, stakes in regional manufacturing, a Midwestern logistics company that turned into a backbone for future acquisitions. She set up trusts to protect infants' inheritances and holding companies to centralize voting rights. When people asked what LCB did, she gave a plain answer. It invested in the foundations of cities, housing, transport, food distribution, because she knew wealth that served was harder to argue with than wealth that only displayed itself. There were many nights she lay awake in the guest house thinking about the small, slow things. Legal architecture is not romance. It is the patient stacking of undeniable documents. It is the way a name on the right paper can reroute 1,000 assumptions. She remembered Cleo's voice then, low and sure. They watch the light, child. You watch the foundation. As LCB's footprint grew, so did the family's sense of proprietorship toward it. Chinua boasted in public about the property he managed and the partnerships he courted. He gave credit to friends and made sweeping, careless statements to reporters about his family's business. Ms. O'Day enjoyed the company of people who assumed her son was at the center of everything. Marcus signed a set of documents at a brunch once with more attention to the pastry platter than to the dotted lines. Tiffany, whose taste was all surface and shine, loved to stand in the foyer of the main house and point to the art and say, "All this is ours now." They assumed that ownership lived in public artifacts, porcelain, chandeliers, the name on a plaque. They did not notice the rooms beneath. Esha learned to sit while they performed. She learned the exact moment to step back to let a sentence wound the loudest. That dinner at the house was not the first time she had been minimized. It was simply the most visible. In the weeks before, Tiffany had rearranged the master bedroom, hung curtains in shades of blush, replaced family photos with glossy images of herself at launch parties. House managers paid handsomely for their discretion, made Esha's presence convenient and occasional. They asked her to supervise staff, to make menus for guests, to ensure the household ran without friction. The subtext of these requests arrived unspoken. You are efficient, you are quiet, you are replaceable. She kept notes as if taking inventory of intent. Who signed what when? Which bank accounts showed balances but not control? The dates of trust fund activations, the registered addresses of shell companies. She had begun years before naming authorized signatories and rotating them with a steady hand. She had prepared contingencies with legal counsel, who were not theatrical men with briefcases and loud voices, but methodical people who could move paperwork with clean confidence. Her counsel had fingerprints on petitions and precedent, the kind that moves in the daylight of filings and verification. They were not there to ambush. They were there to make sure the law reflected the truth she had already laid down. "You're doing too much," Portia said the night Esha brought her a stack of cleaned and labeled folders. The assistant perched on the guest house step and flipped through a file with efficient fingers. "This feels like a paper fortress." Esha smiled only once, small and private. "Better to be architect than tenant," she said. She meant it in both senses. Outside the main house, Tiffany's world hummed with the sound of taking. She had a way of turning a space into a stage, all velvet and controlled lighting. She tore down an heirloom rug one afternoon and replaced it with something louder. She invited a lifestyle blogger to photograph the staircase and posted the images with captions that read like invitations. "New beginnings," she wrote. There were comments and likes and a feedback loop of approval. Ms. Odette, flushed with the pleasure of being admired, sent Tiffany a basket of preserves and a card that said how thrilled she was for her son's new life. Chinua began to believe the performance because performances had fooled him before. He started signing documents at parties, initialing forms a server handed him between courses. He assumed good faith in the people around him. Why wouldn't he? Why would anyone imagine that the woman who boiled stock and smoothed napkins could be building something that would not show up on a mantelpiece? Esha observed their ascent the way a gardener watches frost, noting the vulnerable plants, calculating the time of last sun. She kept the brass key beneath her collarbone sometimes when she walked into rooms where the laughter was loud enough to keep the truth dampened. It was a small thing to keep one center, but the key had Cleo's instruction folded into it like a map. "This does not open anything yet. Wait." There were soft cruelties, the kind that settle like dust. At a family luncheon, someone asked Esha to help pass the gravy and then made a joke about hiring help to keep their lives tidy. A friend of Tiffany's, visiting from the city, complimented the house staff for their charm and gave Esha a patronizing smile that landed like an accusation. To the outside eye, Esha was merely helpful. To the people who had drawn themselves all the lines of entitlement, she was beneath notice. Yet every unseen margin held a document, or a wire, or a trust beneficiary designation filed by Esha's counsel. The world of public accounts and corporate press releases was noisy, but the quieter world of legal instruments, registered agents, subordinate LLCs, the ring of a notary's stamp, was where Esha had spent her currency. She had taken the slow path, the one that required no spectacle but offered an inalterable truth. A name on the right paper is stronger than 1,000 dinner seat claims. The day the property manager came, there had been a deliberate choreography. Esha had not arranged for dramatic theatrical timing. She had arranged for legal preparedness. The manager's document was a notification of pending guardianship over the estate's day-to-day operations during verification. It was not a dramatic seizure. It was a formal routine, the sort of thing a law firm prepares when property is transferred. Chinua, given weeks earlier a stack of promotional bids and friendly offers, had never demanded to see the underlying title work. He had never asked the question her grandmother taught her to ask: who holds the papers? He handed the notice to Tiffany as if passing along an incidental note. Tiffany, who had spent the evening rearranging cushions and rehearsing triumphant smiles, read the words as foreign and then as sharp. She looked at Chinua, at Miss Odette. Their faces red like flags, surprised and then, for some, indignant, for others blank with the denial of the comfortable. There was a ripple of confusion that moved through them like cold blood. Esha stood in the doorway of the guest house and watched them find themselves without the pattern they had been following. Inside the guest house, she opened a drawer and took out an envelope she had kept for a long time. It was heavy with tape and with decisions. On its face, in neat script, was written, LCB Group, Core Holdings. She had been building this folder one signature at a time, the way a grandmother stitches a quilt. Each square a small verification, each seam a legal binding. The folder contained interstate deeds, trust instruments, a certificate showing a majority vote in a holding company, and the names of trustees who answered only to her. It contained proofs of funds and the registration documents for subsidiaries across the region. On paper, LCB was hers. On paper, it was a $20 billion enterprise in accumulated investment and valuation. The number sat on the top page like a quiet claim, 20 beers. She laid the pages out on the small guest house table. The lamp threw a soft pool of light. The hydrangeas outside the guest house window were a dark silver silhouette. She could feel the distance between the house and the guest house like a wideness of field. Everything she had built seemed at once fragile and indestructible, an architecture of law that refused to be embarrassed into disappearance. Her fingers traced the brass key at her throat. She remembered how Cleo had laughed, not unkindly, the day she handed it to her. "You keep it and you watch," Cleo had said. "You'll know when it's time to use it. The world will always make room for people who are loud. Make room for the people who are quiet, too." Esha's phone was on the table beside the folder. Warren's number was in the favorites. His line had answered the last 3 times she needed precision rather than applause. She could call him now and begin to move the pieces already set in motion. Her counsel had been ready for months, drafting papers and lining up custodial banks prepared to effect whatever transfers were necessary in strict accordance with filings already recorded. Nothing about the move would be illegal. Everything about it would be efficient and unambiguous. There would be no fistfights or dramatic banners, only the slow, certain work of aligning paper with truth. She did not call immediately. There was a cadence she kept to herself, a careful enjoyment of the moment before action. She looked once more at the cornbread dish she had wrapped and put in the refrigerator, at the small photograph she kept of herself in cap and gown, at the brass key cupped in her palm. Outside, somewhere across the lawn, laughter rose and fell like breath. Inside, the guest house's single bulb hummed. Portia arrived before the call was made, stepping lightly up the little porch steps, as if the house itself had taught her to walk softly. She took one look at the folder and raised an eyebrow, but there was no astonishment in her face, only steadiness, the kind of professional recognition that had been honed over late nights and early meetings. "Everything we need?" Portia asked. Esha nodded. "Everything or the most important parts. The rest can wait." They worked in a single rhythm, folding papers into envelopes, drafting emails with subject lines that were neither flamboyant nor secretive. The legal team had left instructions that could be activated as soon as the authorization came through. Warren would secure a clear line of custody with the banks. Counsel would file the motions. Custodial agents would act not at the whim of a person but under the direction of documented authority. She moved with the assurance of someone who had spent years buying time in small, lawful increments. Outside, under magnolia trees, Deshawn's car had pulled up and left a smear of dust on the gravel. He sent word, a small, oblique message. "They're excited, there's a party downtown, everyone's there." Esha considered the timing. A gala was scheduled in 2 nights, an annual event where names were read and champagne glasses clinked. It would be an occasion of spectacle and ego, the perfect stage for a revelation that required no vulgarity. She liked the idea of a room full of people whose assumptions had been allowed to fester, a room where she could stand and simply say what was true, and let the law do the rest. She listened to the hum of the guest house, to the thin weight of her own breath. She placed the brass key on top of the folder, as if it could press the papers down into certainty. The key was small, but it had the heft of an entire season of waiting. When she finally dialed Warren, her thumb did not tremble. It was a precise action, a movement of habit and decision. The line rang once, twice. She heard the click of an answering machine for a heartbeat, then a voice she knew, calm, efficient, slightly amused, on the other end. "Esha," Warren said. "At this hour, I was just about to leave for the weekend." "Not a weekend," she said, folding her hands over the brass, feeling its warmth. "Not yet. I need you to be ready. We move when I say." There was a pause long enough for the gravity of the words to hold their shape. Esha could feel the hair along her arms prick with the anticipation that follows a decision finally made visible. Somewhere beyond the guest house window, a porch light winked like an old familiar. Inside, the folder sat like a laid foundation. "They don't know," Warren said, in the tone of someone quietly delighted by a competent design. "I assume not." "They do not," Esha said. Her voice was the same steady instrument it had always been. "And they won't. If we do this right." She listened, and in his measured reply there was the mechanical assurance that comes from men who move things in the daytime of legality. Filings in place, counsel alerted, custodial banks prepared to accept recorded instruments. "It would not be instantaneous," Warren said. "The law moves in its own cadence." Still, he used words that felt like the click of a well-made lock, signed, verified, frozen pending review. Esha didn't need promises of instant fireworks. She needed method, patience, and the quiet power of undeniable paper. She slid the brass key back over her neck and looked at Portia, who had been watching the guest house window, and then turning back to clear a small plate. "What happens next?" Portia asked. "We let it unfold the way paper does," Esha said. "We let the papers speak." The night outside was a kind of darkened audience. The hydrangeas pressed their shapes against moonlit glass. In the main house, laughter still threaded through rooms. Here, in the guest house, there were documents and resolve. Esha folded the folder closed and tucked it into a satchel. She pulled on a coat that had seen better winters, and buttoned it with fingers steady and unflustered. She was not the sort for spectacle. She had always been the kind of person who let others perform, and then quietly changed the scenery. Tonight she walked back toward the light as if she were returning to a thing she had only momentarily left. She would be small at the gilded party if that was what the world expected. She would be poised, patient, and quiet. But the papers were set to be the loudest voice in the room. On the porch of the main house as she passed, Ms. O'Day stood beneath a lamp, adjusting a shawl, looking like the woman who had always kept the family map of status. She glanced toward the guest house door, and then at Esha. There was something unreadable in the way she looked, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, or the first tremor of a thought that would not yet name itself. Tiffany lounged by the doorway, an imagined queen in heels, and smiled at Esha in that way of someone who reserves benevolence for those she believes to be beneath her. "Enjoy the moon," she said, half a joke, half a practice of being kind within hierarchy. Esha raised her chin. "You too," she said. She didn't argue. She didn't announce anything. She moved through their assumptions like a person walking a familiar route through a village, each step measured and known. Inside the guest house, the satchel rested against the lamp on the table, the brass key tucked inside. Esha sat for a moment on the small couch and let the weight of the evening fall around her like a cloak. The world was loud in the main house. In here, there was a stillness that had been cultivated over years. She thought of Grandma Cleo and the way age had taught a different kind of strength. Cleo had not been theatrical about justice. She had been meticulous. She taught Esha to see people as they arranged themselves, to notice not only who sat at the head of the table but who wrote the checks. Esha stood and walked to the guest house window. The hydrangeas were a darkened sea. She set her palm against the glass, and in the reflection she saw herself. Small hands, hair caught back, a line of light along her cheek. The brass key caught a sliver of moon and winked. There were still things to prepare. Press releases neutral and plain for counsel to issue if asked, the careful orchestration of bank communications, a list of trustees to authorize the moves. None of it was dramatic. It was procedure. It was the way civilization ensured that truth had witnesses. She reached for her phone again. Warren was on standby. Portia had the coffee ready for whatever late-night hours might come, and the folder was waiting like a patient promise. Esha's thumb hovered. Beyond the house, a car door shut, laughter like glass. Inside, a small domestic ritual closed. She wrapped the cornbread dish in foil and slid it into the fridge, a private comfort. Then she pressed the call. A ring, a click, a familiar voice. "Esha," Warren said. She steadied herself on the word. "Now," she said simply, the single word that turned patience into motion. There was a pause that felt full of the shape of many days. On the other side of the line, a sound like paperwork being set down met her meaningfully, and the voice that had been amused before turned professional. "Understood," he said. "We begin." She let the words fall into the quiet of the guest house and, for a moment, allowed herself to imagine the room where the gala would be 2 nights hence. Chandeliers, applause, Tiffany's planned announcement, the hush that follows a name called wrong. She imagined the paper she had laid out aligning with the truth it finally described. Outside in the large house, a fork clinked against porcelain. Esha lifted the brass key from her neck once more, and felt its literal, comforting weight. It had not opened anything yet, not in the sense of a door swinging to reveal treasure. It had only been a promise, now it was a timing device, now it was, finally, a beginning. She hung it back at her throat and let the quiet close in, a tide that bends a shoreline without spectacle. She would not shout. She would not demean. She would let the law, the paper, and the small, undeniable facts do the work people almost never bother to notice until their world is different. And then she stood, took the satchel, and stepped out into a night that had room enough for both lemonade and consequence. A porch swing creaked in the warmer wind. The hydrangeas shivered. She walked toward the house on feet that had for years been as certain as a metronome, and the brass key sat, cool and luminous, against her chest. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. The gala was the sort of room that made edges disappear. Glass, polished shoes, a ceiling that held its own chandeliers like careful hosts. People moved as if choreography had taught them where to stand. Microphones promised praise. Program cards printed names in fonts meant to confer importance. Tiffany had rehearsed her smile for weeks, a practiced arc meant to look like gratitude. Mr. Levinson from the chamber introduced her with a compliment that was half invitation and half coronation. Chinua sat beside her, proud in the way of men who have learned to expect applause for someone else's labor. Cameras angled for a portrait of success. Esha arrived without fanfare. She did not need the press to notice her. The press had never needed to. She walked in a simple coat that might have been mistaken for an understated choice, rather than a deliberate one. The brass key did not glint like a prop. It lay against her collarbone as it always had, small and steady. She stood at the fringe of the room for a moment, watching the mouths she had fed, and the people who had assumed their places listen to Tiffany's practiced anecdote about growth and reinvention. She let them speak. There was a certain pleasure in that. Let them speak their rehearsed truths. Let them make claims in a room of witnesses. It is a useful thing to name the lie in public because a lie sounds loudest when everyone is singing along. Warren was waiting near a back corridor, the precise expression of someone who had spent his life arranging rooms for other people to walk through in safety. He nodded once, a small private signal that the mechanics were in place. Counsel had been selective and methodical. Filings recorded, custodial banks on notice, trustees empowered to act under the conditions spelled out months earlier. Contingency had been built into contingency. The work had been quiet, but it had not been idle. Esha had not chosen spectacle. She had chosen undeniable facts. When Tiffany took the podium and began the paragraph about vision, the word as soft as a curtain, Esha listened for the moment the microphone passed. That was the moment her papers would outshine 1,000 rehearsed smiles. There was no shout. There was no dramatic throw of documents across a table. She waited until the house music softened, waited for the polite applause to taper. Then she walked forward with a composed gait that made her small in the way of someone who refuses to be shrunk by others. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was even and calm. It fit into the room like a new instrument. Heads turned, the sort that habit trains to notice the sudden absence of certainty. She did not say, "You are mistaken," or "This is mine now," with the triumphant glee some expected. She said what the papers said. She said the names written in company record books. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and the microphone closed the distance for her. "My name is Esha Carter. I am the founder and controlling shareholder of LCB Group, and the records reflect that LCB is a $20 billion enterprise comprised of holdings across housing, logistics, and regional development." A murmur traveled like a small wind through the room. Tiffany's smile flickered. Chinua's hand, previously poised on a napkin, slid. Ms. Odette's expression collected into a practiced calm that might yet break if pressed. Esha had prepared nothing to make them small. She presented nothing to wound. She simply let the law speak, and in that room the law had witnesses who could read the same documents she had in the guest house. She'd brought with her a neutral folder, copies available for counsel to hand to whoever needed them. Nothing theatrical, because legality relies on transparent records more than on sparks. Authorized trustees have been empowered, and proper filings were recorded with the regional registry months ago, she continued. Any transfers made without the authorized signatories are unauthorized and will be reversed under counsel and custody agreements. Our custodial banks have been notified. Procedures are in motion. It was a careful sentence that assumed no melodrama. It assumed that people would listen, and then the machinery of institutions would do their jobs. That was exactly how she wanted it. Not revenge, but correction. Phones lifted like small mirrors. Some kept filming. Someone nearby hissed, "She's lying," in a tone that sounded like a script read badly. Warren, discreet as ever, exchanged a nod with counsel at a table where a neutral representative recorded the moment in a notebook. There are bodies that do work quietly. There are systems that take their time, and then, under the right pressure, perform without fuss. Esha had supplied those systems with clear instructions. Tiffany tried to speak. Her voice, used to being the loudest, found itself reduced at once to something uncertain. "This is," she began. She was cut short not by force, but by the very things that are usually left unexamined at parties. Signatures, certified copies, trustee declarations. A legal counsel in a navy suit walked to the podium carrying a single folder and read aloud in a level voice the filings that made most of the room. A crowd used to headlines and not to documents, slowly, methodically understand. LCB Group, core holdings are held under the Carter Family Trust, he read. Authorized signatories identified are Esha Carter, Trustee Marlowe, Trustee D. Hayes. Transfers recorded under file numbers 198B and 199B are sealed pending further verification and contain no authorization from the listed trustees for the transfer of equity to third-party entities or individuals. Custodial institutions have been instructed to freeze movement and await order of clarification. It was legally blunt and emotionally surgical. The word freeze had the odd effect of making champagne sound like a poor idea. Chinua found his voice in fragments. "There must be a mistake," he said. A man in a room full of people used to being affirmed now spoke like someone lost in a map he never read. They had assumed the surface was the thing of consequence. The sofas, the art, the dinners. They had not understood that property and possession are more than ceremony. She had always understood that. Her grandmother had taught her to watch the foundation. There was a careful pause where the air in the room reoriented itself around a new center. Cameras tilted toward the podium. Reporters shifted through their devices like court stenographers. Someone reached for Chinua's wrist as if to steady him. He pulled away, not in rage, but in the kind of bewilderment that comes when reality is no longer authored by one's assumptions. In the days after the gala, institutions moved with the measured speed of the legitimate. Custodial banks confirmed holdings and imposed temporary administrative freezes to allow counsel to review instruments. Trustees affirmed their roles. Filings that had been dormant popped like the caps of long-corked bottles. Agents arrived not to make headlines but to enforce recorded intent. Cards delivered. Vehicles returned to custodial lots where liens were asserted. Assets reallocated under the terms previously recorded. There were quiet repossessions. A leased car collected by a towing company under a custodial order, keys left in envelopes in front of a townhouse door. There were corporate notices sent to office addresses, to trustees, to the official record. The media flashbulbs found the stories they preferred: Tiffany's account of embarrassment, Chinua's stammered interviews. But much of the work was thick with papers and stamps, and the small bureaucratic language that takes the place of shouting in the presence of law. Ms. Odette issued a statement that read like a carefully hand-sorted apology. "We were surprised," it began. "We are reviewing the facts," it ended. Her tone was one of social recalibration, the public performance of grace while private hires scrambled to examine ledgers and ask questions aloud, the way people step on shells and listen for echoes. Marcus took a hit he hadn't expected. Deals he had been leaning on, partnership contracts and letters of intent, were withdrawn politely by firms that preferred clarity. A partner called him and said, in the corporate voice that is a soft guillotine, "We need to see authorized signatories before proceeding." His calendar, once full of lunches meant to cement future deals, became a list of canceled reservations and solo drinks. Tiffany's social following bled into an audience that favored schadenfreude. Sponsors at first tweeted cautious sympathy, and then, as corporate counsel advised, withdrew market mentions. The home she had redecorated became suddenly heavy with all that is purchased to show and not to substantiate. She took down staged photos and found fewer friends at her parties later that month. The world receded for her in a way that had nothing to do with being cruel, and everything to do with being exposed as someone who mistook photos for proof. Chinua did not fall into melodrama. He moved as if sleepwalking through rooms he had expected to own. There was one morning when the movers left a pile of cardboard boxes on a porch, and a friend who owed him favors was not picking up calls. There was the quiet embarrassment of a man used to a certain exterior, who now had to seek shelter in the guest suite that had once been Esha's. He rented a small apartment, the sort that has a kettle and no art, and learned anew to measure windows as if they were things that could be learned, not given. There was no dramatic public shaming orchestrated by Esha. The scene she had wanted was not spectacle, it was truth. She let the legal process do the necessary unwrapping. She did not post his failures. She avoided a microphone that would amplify vengeance. Her dignity was not a performance. She had been taught that dignity is a claim you make on how you will live, not on how loud you can say someone else is wrong. There were small, inevitable confrontations. Ms. Odette came to the door of the guest house one afternoon, her expression a careful blend of matriarch and woman who had been surprised awake. The hydrangeas cast their old blue shade between them. Esha poured tea into 2 mismatched cups, 2 cups Esha had brought from her childhood kitchen, and handed one over. "You did well," Ms. Odette said, more a statement than an apology. It did not absolve anything. It recognized a reality the woman was not sure she had deserved to face. Esha did not accept the praise like a triumph. She accepted it like a fact. "I did what I had to," she replied. "I did not want to be in the position of needing to prove myself with noise." Ms. Odette's eyes softened in the way of a woman who had been taught to prize appearances, and now found herself accounting for the currency of reality. "We never asked," she said. Esha stirred her tea. The gesture was deliberate and small. "You didn't need to ask," she said. "You needed to look." Not every member of the family sought reconciliation. Some retreated into defensive patterns, denial, blame, a kind of despair that is comfortable because it lets one avoid responsibility. But the core facts were not mutable. Trustees sat down and read records. Banks placed custodies on accounts. The public narrative shifted from glitter to ledger. Portia kept her job. She kept an even temper and a careful address book. For all the noise around them, some things in Esha's life remained steady. Portia continued to manage communications and take care of logistics. She made sure the mundane work, bills, contracts, trustees' meetings, happened so that the machinery of legitimacy could do its work. Warren remained a quiet actor behind the stage. He took the calls that required discretion and the meetings that required restraint. He had, as many of his clients liked to say in less polite moments, good taste, for what needed to be done, and no appetite for commentary. He arranged a meeting with trustees in the firm offices that smelled of lemon oil and paper. They signed the motions required for clarity. These were not dramatic gestures. They were the phrases in a contract that move mountains by inches. The public saw the faster elements: cars repossessed, mansions listed, parties that shrank. The private realities were slower. Council summoned signatures, trustees deliberated. Family lawyers negotiated settlements for use of personal items and access to sentimental artifacts. Esha offered options reasonable in form and final in purpose. She knew the difference between justice and humiliation. She wanted the first, she refused the second. Months later, the main house was on the market. Ms. Odette arranged, with the same social grace she had always used, an estate sale in the way of women who know how objects make histories legible. Marcus found that his calendar's emptiness had become a kind of pause to think. Chinua moved on to a job that required early mornings and sober consultancy. Tiffany left the city that had been her stage and took a position at a boutique firm in a different region. None of these departures looked like theatrical punishment. They looked like consequences doing the work they always do, lurching people into needed self-examination by way of changed circumstance. Esha did not watch these things like a person who had been satisfied. She watched them like someone who had been taught to observe how people remade themselves in the wake of being seen plainly. Reconciliation found some and eluded others. She made room where she could and kept firm where law demanded. Her actions were not cruel, they were precise. In the end, the thing that settled most softly was not the redistribution of assets but the recovery of quiet authority. LCB Group continued, a $20 billion concern with trustees who followed the letter of recorded intent and directors who answered to duties rather than to spectacle. Esha returned to the day-to-day that she had always preferred. Meetings about sustainable housing projects, the quiet pleasure of meeting a new director who understood the value of low-income housing that actually remained affordable. A call from a mayor thanking her for a transit investment that made a real difference to workers in a neighborhood she remembered walking through as a child. Once, late in the season, she found herself back on a porch that smelled of magnolia and laundry starch. The Mississippi sun had the easy kindness of a place that measured seasons by little things. The way light hit the rocking chair slats, the softness of a cornbread crumb in a Tupperware, the skein of an old family photograph with its thumb-worn corners. She sat in the same rocking chair Grandma Cleo had used and let the slow motion of the porch do its work. The brass key lay on the table beside her like something that had been waiting to be looked at. It did not glitter as triumph. It sat with the pleasant weight of an object that had been used often in thought. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. The metal had been warmed by her neck 1,000 times. She wondered at the way small objects carry stories, the way they compress time into the grooves of their metal. Grandma Cleo's memory sat in the blue of the hydrangeas and the smell of starch. Esha thought, as she had thought many times, of how Cleo had sent her into the world with a lesson that was both a rebuke and a blessing. "You keep it, and you watch," the old woman had said. "Not everyone gets to be the loudest. You learn how to be the kind of person the world mistakes for small." She did not hold the key like a weapon. She held it like a keepsake, like a small instrument of measure. The lesson had not been to lie and wait to strike, but to be ready to correct a ledger. The key was a symbol of timing, of when to call counsel, when to let institutions perform, when to step forward in a room and let the microphone give you a fair hearing. Neighbors drifted by with greetings. A woman from down the lane brought over a plate of cornbread that tasted like salt and sugar and sundae. Esha invited her to sit. They talked about the weather and the new developments across town that LCB was funding, housing with green spaces and reliable transit. It was the kind of conversation that makes policy feel like human care. In the background, a child laughed as if the world were still a place where joy could be simple. Portia called from the city with a report on a new trust structure that would preserve funding for educational scholarships in perpetuity. Esha listened, making notes. Her life was a small blend of domestic ease and legal stewardship now. There was a quietness to it that suited her, the steady work of stewardship over spectacle. Once she walked the property line with an old neighbor who had known her family for 40 years. The neighbor told a story about how Cleo had once bartered a batch of pies for a mechanic's help. No contracts, only neighborly exchange. Esha laughed and nodded and thought about how her grandmother had moved in both worlds, the informal networks of kindness and the formal arrangements that keep institutions honest. She kept the page of photos she had taken at graduation in a drawer at home, the edges softened by thumb and time. She took out the cornbread dish she had wrapped months before in the guest house and reheated a slice. The taste was a memory and a comfort. The hydrangeas still leaned against the brick, sometimes melancholy, sometimes proud, depending on the sun. A letter came from Ms. Odette several months later, in an envelope that had taken the choice of a stationery store and a stamp. It was short. It read, "I did not understand before. Thank you for holding us to things we should have asked about. I am sorry." Esha kept the letter not on her mantle but in a box with 100 other small proofs. Receipts, humble notes, things that people hand each other when lives are rearranged. She felt no triumphant joy. She felt only the steadiness that had always followed acts done properly. A cleansing of misunderstandings, the soothing of a ledger that once had been crooked. People sometimes ask what the brass key opened. There is a small temptation in the question, because the key does not open in the cinematic sense. It did not unlock a secret vault of jewels or a hidden room. It unlocked the time it took for people to see things that had always been there. It unlocked the patience necessary to have papers in order when the moment came for the world to ask for proof. If you are fortunate, someone gives you a symbol, and you learn to honor it. Elsewhere in the world, people shout and cause spectacle. In Esha's case, the instrument of change was an accumulation of signatures and careful trust work, and the patience to wait to call counsel when everything was ready. On the porch, watching the hydrangeas and the sunlight, she felt the quiet pleasure of being someone who had chosen preparation over display. There was a finality to the knowledge that the world would now look at LCB and see the people it served, and the structures that held its mission. Not only the chandeliers and the parties where people took poses. The brass key lay in her palm. She closed her hand around it like the closing chapter of a book that had been written carefully over years. In the background, a church bell chimed the hour. Someone down the lane split wood with a measured hand. Life, as she had always known, moves on the scale of small things. Contracts signed, meals made, gardens tended. She placed the key into the box with the other papers, the graduation photograph, the letter from Ms. Odette, the recipe Grandma Cleo had once scribbled for cornbread. It was a domestic reliquary rather than a trophy case. She rocked in the chair and let the late afternoon settle around her shoulders like a shawl. Someone asked once in the flurry after the gala if she had wanted to humiliate them. Esha had answered, then as now with the same steady thought. Humiliation is not a measure of justice. She wanted correctness, no more, no less. She had been treated as if she were staff in her own life. She had not retaliated in spectacle. She had arranged for the record to accord with the truth. Those who had mistaken ceremony for ownership would have to untangle their own assumptions in private. There were nights, rare and private, when she thought about the dinner table and the joke about domestic staff. The living memory of being made small was not a wound she wanted to reopen publicly. It was an old thing now, a lesson worked through by the careful measures she had taken. In a sense, the whole episode had been a lesson in the currency of attention, where people place it and where they fail to look. The hydrangeas, the brass key, the cornbread dish, these were the modest reliquaries of a life that had chosen patience and precision. Esha kept them not as trophies but as markers of the way she had chosen to move through the world, quietly, with intention and always with an eye to the foundation. When the sun finally laid itself down behind the magnolia trees and the porch light flicked on, she rose and locked the door. The brass key did not unlock anything new that night. It simply rested where it had always been meant to rest, in the small chest of things that make a life honest. If this story spoke to you, if the quiet patience of correction matters in a world that so often values noise, there are more like it. Check the description below for related stories, and watch another video to see how other people choose steadiness over spectacle.